It's my pleasure this morning to get to introduce Taylor Blatchford. And Taylor is a news producer at the Seattle Times, where she develops audience engagement strategies, connecting with readers through social media and leading digital strategy for the newsroom's investigative team. And very relevant for all of us, she writes a weekly newsletter called The Lead to provide resources and connections for student journalists, which, by the way, I read basically every week and I highly recommend. Taylor is a graduate of the Missouri School of Journalism, where she previously reported on the future of news with a focus on student media at the Poynter Institute. At the Columbia Missourian, she led a team focused on bringing community engagement into the reporting process and reported on health and higher education. She also wrote and edited at Investigative Reporters and Editors and Politico Europe, where she developed engagement strategies to reach an international audience. So with that, I'll turn it over to Taylor for her presentation.
Thanks so much, James, and hi, everyone. Thanks so much to Nieman for having me here virtually. I wish that I could be talking to you all in Boston instead of in my home office in my bedroom, but it's great to be here, and I will go ahead and share my screen. So I'm going to talk today about the state of student journalism, which is a pretty big topic given everything that's happened in the last year. I mean, we know that student journalists are always covering their campus and their communities day in and day out, but I feel like the past year there's been even more attention on the great work that students are doing in covering their schools and their communities. So there's a lot to cover, but I'm excited to be here with you all this morning. Oops. Okay, there we go. So yeah, thanks so much to James for that introduction. The main thing you need to know is, that I work at the Seattle Times for my actual full-time job, but then I also write the newsletter on the side, and that's been just a really great way for me to connect with students in the past few years, and I've learned so much through this process. A little bit about myself to start. I first got involved in journalism as a high school student. I'm from the Denver area, the suburbs of Denver. And when I was in school there, I took a just intro to journalism class in high school, just because I thought it would be something that could be interesting. I liked writing and just had a really great teacher there who then really became a mentor for me throughout school. So I joined the newspaper, did the high school newspaper thing, really liked that. Was lucky to be at a school that had the resources that we could have a newspaper and website, a news website, and then we worked together with the team that produced the yearbook and things like that. So that was my first taste of journalism, and actually the first time I came to Seattle too was for a high school journalism conference, so it felt very full circle when I moved here for the job at the Times. So then I went to college at the University of Missouri and studied journalism there. I was really excited to get to be part of their journalism program, and they have a lot of cool specialties and concentrations and opportunities for students to work at different local publications. So when I was there, I focused on news reporting, ended up with an emphasis in investigative reporting. I worked for the student newspaper, the Man-Eater, for my first 2 years as a reporter covering higher education, and then as the university news editor during a pretty tumultuous year that included a lot of student protests over racism at the university, and then ultimately a hunger strike by a graduate student, a boycott by the football team that got national attention, and then the resignation of the president of the university and the chancellor on the same day. So it was a pretty eventful time to be an editor, and really was a learning experience and a great way to get experience covering breaking news, and learning what it's like when national media comes into your school to cover something there. Then I also ended up getting some experience in the audience engagement, social media, digital journalism side of things through an internship that I had, which was the work at Politico that James mentioned. So that was really interesting and kind of opened my eyes to a new part of journalism that I hadn't been as aware of when I was focused on reporting and editing. So I just really started diving into how journalists could connect with their audiences and really focus on better serving their audiences and the different tools and methods they can use for that. Then after I graduated, I had this fellowship at the Poynter Institute in Florida for a summer and did a lot of reporting for them on student journalism. And that was kind of where the idea for the lead started to form, because I was seeing that all of these students around the country were facing similar issues and going through a lot of the same things, but there weren't a lot of centralized resources for student journalists in terms of connecting them from school to school, or it's hard to see sometimes what other schools' publications are doing. So there were just a lot of things that I came to know over that fellowship that then provided the foundation for the newsletter. And then I got my job at the Seattle Times about 2.5 years ago, and I've been here since then. So as James said, I work on our digital team, and then I also work closely with our investigative team. So it's a mix of working on digital strategy and engagement for those longer term investigative projects, but then also for the day-to-day breaking news and working really with editors and reporters across the whole newsroom to do things like curate our web homepage and get things out on social media and work on newsletters and all sorts of online avenues for presenting our journalism. So there's a little overview of me, and then a little bit more about the newsletter, since that provides the foundation for a lot of things I'll talk about. Like I mentioned in that fellowship at Poynter, I really just created the idea for this based on what do I wish I had had when I had been a student journalist. And there really that comes down to those things that I list in those bullet points, resources. I was lucky to be at the University of Missouri that had a lot of great resources for its students and journalism students, but I know that that's an exception, not the rule for journalism schools. And some of you are probably coming from schools that don't have a dedicated journalism school, and the student newspaper is the way to get that experience. And I also just wanted to provide a way for students to learn from each other and see, this is how this other school and publication handled this really tricky issue, or this is this great project that they did. Maybe we can learn something from that. So I really just started that on my own, and it's been really fun to see it grow from a few hundred people who were mostly people that I knew or friends of friends from Mizzou or things like that, to now a few thousand people. And I partner with Poynter on that. So that's been a great way to reach a broader audience as well. So there's my overview, but today we're going to talk about, for addressing the state of student journalism, some of the challenges that student publications and student journalists are facing, some solutions and some ways that I've seen student journalists innovate and address these challenges. And then I'm going to spotlight a few different examples of work that's really stood out to me in the past few years of working on the newsletter and reading a lot of student journalism and talking with a lot of student journalists. So that's what we'll go through today, but and I'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end too. So if you think of something along the way, definitely I'll leave a good amount of time for that so we can have a discussion at the end. Okay, so to start out, a big challenge that I think we've really seen during the pandemic, but that was a case before that, was a challenge that faces a lot of local newspapers. How do we make money? Because you can't print a newspaper or pay a staff or run a publication without money. So something that has definitely faced student papers is just figuring out how to be sustainable online, and that's not an issue unique to student papers. It's something that the whole newspaper industry has been facing for a while. So this is something that I think has been accelerated during the pandemic, because talking with a lot of students around the country, when campuses closed last spring, suddenly there aren't students on campus to pick up your paper. So what's the purpose of having a print paper, and how do you get news to them most effectively? So through that, I've seen some interesting solutions, and some of those are pandemic specific, like creating a pop-up newsletter for coronavirus news, so that students can stay informed on campus news that way. But then other papers, even before the pandemic, have reduced the days that they print and decided to make their paper maybe focus on the print editions of the paper focus on bigger features or analyses or things that would be relevant for more than just the day that they print. And there have also just been some really interesting ways that papers have fundraised and thought outside the box to make money and show their audiences how they can better support them. So that's something we'll talk about a little bit later with some of these examples. But that's definitely a big challenge that I've seen that probably a lot of you have had to grapple with as well. Another thing that definitely faces a lot of schools is just censorship and pushback from administrators and your schools in general, whether at the college or the high school level. People don't always like what you report. This is especially harder for papers that that get funding from their schools, because then the school in some cases can threaten to cut their funding if they report on something that they're not happy with. So that can be an issue, definitely. And then, this also applies to schools just being really reluctant to give student journalists information or to publicize information. Another thing we saw during the pandemic was just, a real secrecy in some cases about how the school was responding to the outbreak, how many cases were on campus. I don't want to throw my alma mater under the bus, but at the University of Missouri, they launched in the fall when they started in person. They had this, they called a data dashboard, but it was like 3 numbers. I don't think you could really call it a dashboard. Like, this is the total number of cases. This is the number of people who've recovered. And then this is like the number of student versus faculty cases. So it was some information, but it was very limited and not something that was totally helpful to the community to see the state of things on campus. Um, so something that has been just really essential in terms of protecting student journalists in these situations and guarding against this administrative censorship is the work that's been done by a lot of organizations, particularly the Student Press Law Center, to protect student press rights and the rights of student journalists to publish without fear of retaliation or censorship or prior review from their schools. So they are doing really great work always to protect student journalists from that sort of pushback. Of course, there could always be pushback after something that you report, but they're just a really helpful resource when it comes to they have free legal advice and a free hotline that you can contact. So definitely would recommend that as a resource for students. And another issue that I think has really been brought into the spotlight in the past year is that in a lot of cases, student publications don't look like their schools as a whole and don't look like the communities they're covering. This is something that I've talked with a lot of students about in the past year, and they've talked about efforts that they're making to bring in more voices to their publication, and that I know that was something that we faced when I was working at the campus paper as well. Was if we're a predominantly white editorial board at the paper, how do we bring in people who will be able to better tell the stories of our community? And a big issue in student papers can be that there's not enough funding in most cases to pay staff positions. In some cases, there's not funding to pay editors. So how do you make it work for students who are working or need to pay their own expenses through college, who don't have time to do unpaid work at the paper? So that's definitely something that I think there's been a growing awareness of, and I've been really impressed by the way a lot of publications have addressed this issue. Just there's not really an easy solution, but in terms of doing demographic reports and surveys of their staff, and then also really examining their coverage to see maybe what they can be doing better, auditing. We'll talk about one example that I really liked where they audited the diversity of their staff, but also their sources and their visuals, and really took a deep dive into every part of their publication to see, how can we be more representative and how can we be doing better. So there's not really one, easy solution, or a lot of, we've seen so many professional newsrooms also face these different issues in the past year. And it's been clear that there's not an easy solution, but this is slow work of building trust that has to be done over time. But there are things that can be done more quickly, like adopting staff policies with the input of different groups that can make your journalism more inclusive. And then finally, another challenge is that local newspapers around the country have really been shrinking in the last the last 2 decades almost. And again, this is something that was an issue before the pandemic, but the pandemic has affected quite a bit as well. And we saw so many layoffs in the past year of local journalists and some local publications that had to close entirely. So there are plenty of cases where your college publication might be the only daily paper or daily news site covering a certain community, particularly in some, it's not the case somewhere like Boston, but in a smaller community that maybe its local paper had to cut back to be a weekly paper instead of daily, or closed entirely. The college and student publications are really filling a really crucial need in those cases. So that's something that I think student journalists should really consider, and editors, when you're planning your coverage. Look at your community and figure out, what's missing in that sort of coverage too from your local publications, whether it's, the intersection of the city and the university when policies are being passed by city council or the mayor that will also have an effect on the university. But in some cases too, that might mean having a dedicated city hall reporter if that's something that your community really needs coverage of. That can really be a way too to bring in people to read your publication who might not be the traditional student and faculty audiences, but can be people who see the value of your coverage and that you're not only serving the campus, that you're also there for the community. So I want to hear from you all as well. What did I what did I miss in my list there, and what are things that you all have seen, that could be in the past year of news, or just in general in your time as student journalists? So I don't know. Feel free to just to unmute yourself if you want to share something.
Hi, this is Aidan McGloin. I've been reading the lead since March 2019, so major fan, always appreciated it. I just kind of wanted to double down on the whole issue of fending for the papers. I was talking with CFU student reporters from 5 other California state universities just this week about it, but how their advisors have said that they've always had a lot of money. And I was wondering if you have time later, if you could kind of share some of the business models for the most profit generating but independent student papers you could think of. But yeah, just kind of doubling down on that though.
Sure. Thanks, Aidan. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a big one that really affects so many parts of student publications. How many editors are you able to hire? Are you able to pay people? I think there's some publications addressing it in a really interesting way. There's one example specifically that I'm thinking of that I'll mention later, but then I'm also glad to chat outside this presentation too. Anyone else?
Hi. I think it's been an interesting transition for a lot of us student journalists to deal with the way that we're getting in touch with sources. So when the pandemic hit and a lot of the schools closed down, in fact, UC Davis is still closed for the most part. We had to completely change the way that we reach out to sources. Not so much the administrators, that's pretty much the same as it's always been, but with students. So that means finding other avenues to get in touch with the general student population, utilizing things like Discord or Reddit or Twitter to try and get student sources in a way that we've never done before. So I think that that's something that we've had to kind of evolve in and kind of figuring out how to not hit a wall and get those sources when you need them and think creatively about that.
Definitely. Yeah. Thanks, Kathleen. I think that's a big thing too, because, one of the biggest advantages of being a student covering your own campus is that you're with the student body day in and day out, in class with them and other activities, and you can pick up a lot of story ideas that way. So that's something I hadn't, that totally makes sense, that when you're remote, there's not that same level of interaction with people, and how do you find sources that way? Anyone else that wants to share?
The Heights at Boston College has recently made the decision to go fully digital next semester. And part of that is, instead of printing a weekly print edition, we're now doing a weekly e-edition. So that includes, you know, all of our regular coverage just in a PDF form, sort of, through an outside site. And so our reasoning behind making that move was, first of all, you know, like you said, with ad revenues struggling in print and not being able to reach a large audience, it's sort of, student journalism, like print media, is hemorrhaging money. And so in order to, first of all, save money, but to reach a wider audience and to be able to diversify our coverage and print more, or print, quote unquote, more pages, it was sort of the obvious next step, I think. And I've seen a handful of other papers doing similar things for, you know, similar reasons, being able to reach a wider audience with more subject matter.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense for sure. I talked with I think with 4 or 5 different papers last April or so, as everyone was kind of scrambling to adapt as campuses were sending people home or doing remote classes. And a lot of them talked similarly about, you know, doing e-editions instead. So I'm interested to see now. I should follow up with, with them or with different papers and see, you know, are these changes that you thought would be temporary a year ago, are those things that you've realized, you know, maybe this is just what makes sense moving forward, even as people come back to campus at some point. Does anyone else, one more person, want to go?
So keep in mind, I'm only a freshman at UPenn, so I'm not completely aware of how the Daily Pennsylvanian is facing these challenges. But something I've seen recently in regards to the problem of the lack of diversity is the publication has sent out a demographic survey. And basically, like, the point of the survey is to see like what communities aren't being represented within our staff. And I find that extremely valuable. And I think all publications should be doing that, because how else are you going to know like what voices aren't being represented among your staff? And in addition to that, they do have a diversity committee, which hosts like little training sessions. And it just makes journalists more aware of our inner biases and the importance of finding very diverse sources.
Yeah, thanks, Sheila. That's great. And that's something that I've been really impressed by. A lot of publications that have started to do these, you know, reports once a year, once a semester, you know, and making that information public too, and saying, you know, this is where our staff falls short of representing our school, and, you know, this is how we're trying to be better. That's something that frankly, I wish professional newspapers and publications would be more transparent about. So it's really encouraging to see student journalists, you know, leading the way in that. Okay, I'm going to move on, but we'll definitely have time at the end for more discussion, and I want to hear from anyone else who wanted to share too. But so I'm going to spotlight some different examples that have stood out to me in a few different areas. I read a lot of student work to write the lead, and there's so many things that I, you know, could have included here, but tried to narrow it down. So these are just a few things, but that I thought really addressed the way that student journalists around the country have been facing some of the different challenges that we mentioned, and hopefully one of these or multiple might leave you with an idea that you could bring back to your own publication. So this is a recent example that some of your schools might have participated in, because there were 27 newsrooms that took part in this fundraising competition that was tied to March Madness, the basketball tournament. So I was so excited to see this. The Daily Orange, the student paper at Syracuse, organized this with their alumni board. And the Daily Orange, as a side note, has done a lot of really interesting work in funding their publication. And Aiden, that was the first thing I thought of with your question. You know, they actually launched a membership program in the fall, basically to encourage recurring donations from people. And that's something that, you know, we've seen from professional newsrooms, the nonprofits particularly, that I think has been promising, just in creating deeper connection with people, but also that funding. So that's an example. And I did a newsletter issue about that in the fall. So that was one that really stood out to me as a cool way to move forward with funding. But this competition, basically, they reached out to, I think, over 200 student publications, their fundraising coordinator told me, and these 20 some ended up, responding and wanting to be involved with this competition. So I do have to shout out my my alma mater, the Maneater, in this screenshot, that we got beat by our cross-border rival in Illinois, but still raised, $12,000 that they probably would not have raised otherwise in this 2-week period. So I think the idea of fundraising around a specific event is really powerful. In this case, I think people were extra excited about March Madness since it had been canceled last year, and fans were really invested in seeing their schools. And this was a good way to say, hey, we're also in this competition. Mizzou and Illinois both got knocked out early in the tournament. So this is a way to be like, we can still keep it going and, give us some money. And even though our basketball team didn't do as well as we hoped, we can still do well in this competition. We've also seen this in some student publications that have done these rivalry issues. So the University of North Carolina and Duke, I believe, was the first one to do this. They're huge basketball rivals, so they actually worked together and have done this collaborative issue where basically each publication produces half of a print issue every year. And then it's also a fundraising competition. So leading up to the big rivalry game, they see which paper can raise more money. And that's something that has been adapted by some different publications up here in the Pacific Northwest. The University of Washington and Oregon have both, they worked together. I don't know if they did it last year. They definitely did it 2 years ago for a similar competition. And those are just ways that I think student publications have really gotten creative in raising money. And I hope to see even more of these types of ideas in the future. It was hard to choose what to spotlight from pandemic reporting because there's so many examples. So this was just one that I chose from the Daily Tar Heel at the University of North Carolina. So they used public records in a really interesting way to get emails between university administrators. So this was from, I believe this story came out in the beginning of the fall semester, and UNC was one school that had a lot of cases as they brought students back to campus, and pretty quickly had an outbreak, as we saw in a lot of places when you bring so many people together in person. And they got these public records from the spring, basically, as the university was strategizing over how to respond and how to reopen in the fall. So it basically showed that they knew there was a really high chance that there would be outbreaks on campus, but decided to move forward with reopening anyway. And that was some really great watchdog reporting that stood out to me. But then also in the pandemic, I've been so impressed by schools that have pushed their universities to be more transparent with the data about cases on campus. People across the country, student journalists, have uncovered outbreaks on campus that the university didn't want to talk about. They've created their own data dashboards and ways to track the ongoing cases and the spread of the pandemic. So that's something that I think just has shown to people all around the country, how essential student journalists are in covering these issues. And I've been glad to see a broader awareness in the past year of, student journalists doing this really essential work that they can be the ones to hold their schools accountable. This was kind of what I was alluding to when I talked about diversity and the ways that publications have addressed this issue. This is a really, really impressive example from the Minnesota Daily at the University of Minnesota. There, if you Google like Minnesota Daily Content Diversity Board, you'll find it. They did this like 20-some page report after a year of work. I think this was from the 2019 to 2020 school year. And they had done the things that you mentioned, Sheila, like the staff demographic surveys and looking at the representativeness of their staff and of their editors. But then they also took a really deep look at their own content and their, as you could tell from the name, the Content Diversity Board. But they looked at how they were sourcing their stories and how many sources that were quoted were, were men or women or were people of color. And then they also looked, I believe, at the visuals that they were using in their paper to see how they were representing different groups. And just did this really thorough, like, data-driven audit of their own publication, and then published it all and said, pretty clearly, this is how we want to be better, and this is, we think we've done well in these areas, but then we have so much room for growth. And I think this was so impressive to me because, like I mentioned, this is something that professional newsrooms don't do very well or very often in most cases. So I think that it's great to see this level of transparency from student publications. And there have been others that have done similar great work. Another example that stands out to me is the UCLA, the Daily Bruin did a really thorough staff survey and a whole interactive page that walked through their staff demographics. So the Minnesota Daily definitely isn't the only one doing this work, but it stood out to me just for how thorough it is and how it was really backed by data too. It's one thing to write an editorial and say, this is how we're hoping to improve, but I think having all of the data and, saying we want to get our editorial board from, this level of representation to this in the next year, that's a really great way to show how they can set those goals when they know where they can improve. Another example that has stood out to me was that actually one of my colleagues at Poynter wrote this in-depth story about was the University of Kansas. A professor and some students there created basically this whole online newspaper news site for this community about 10 miles away from the university that had completely lost its daily paper. So they saw a need in this small town, and that people there were really missing the information that having a newspaper provides in a community news source. So this is a collaboration between, it helps, of course, to have the backing of the university to give more structure and have a student staff, but then also a professor who can help manage and create some consistency as students move through and graduate. But they've done really great coverage of this local community. I'm not totally sure. I think it's something that they get class credit for, but just a really interesting model that has shown that if you have students who really want to be involved in local community journalism, look around your university or your college town and look beyond that too and see, where are there gaps that can be filled and how can we be a resource there. And then the last example from the Daily Trojan at USC, they had a really chaotic school year, like the year before the pandemic, with a lot of scandals on campus and just a ton of news regarding their administration, and then also a really hard time for students too. I think there were kind of a string of student suicides or deaths around the same time one semester. So right around that time in 2019, I talked with Natalie, who was on their editorial board and was their first ever wellness and outreach director, I believe was the title. So they created this initiative that I thought was really really valuable and showed a lot of self-awareness that their staff was just facing a lot of burnout after this really intense breaking news. And I think that's something that, journalists everywhere, and I'm sure some of you all that are here are probably feeling after what this past year has looked like, because I know I've been really, really tired at points of, the news that just won't seem to stop. So I think this is something that was relevant, that now is extra relevant during the a year into the pandemic. But they created this dedicated editorial board position as someone really to be a resource for their editors and for their staff, and just to basically set the tone of the newsroom and work on improving the culture. So I think she had monthly check-ins with all of the editors, with one-on-one, just through one-on-ones, and a space to say, we're not just going to talk about the story that you're working on, but we're going to talk about how you're doing and how we can support you, and really creating a staff culture where people felt like they could come to each other with issues and not keep everything pent in and then be slowly burning out. They also did some interesting kind of bonding time that I thought was cool, where they would eat dinner together every so often, but have no laptops, no phones, no news. You're just there to really spend time with each other and to really talk. So this is something that I think I'm really interested to see how student newsrooms address burnout and mental health going forward, because it's really hard to do to keep up the pace of work and to do your best work if you're not also taking a step back and taking care of yourself as a person and checking in with your staff. So those are the examples that I want to talk about. And with that, I'll leave the last 15 minutes for any questions that you all have. There's my contact info also. The Blatchford TR is my Twitter, and then always feel free to email and reach out. And then there's also the bit.ly that leads to the newsletter sign up. So if you want to see more of these type of examples or talking about these different challenges, that's a resource that I plan on continuing. So yeah, with that, any questions?
Hi, I'm really interested in community journalism, where the students go into a community and they create that relationship, like with the Adora Times, I think it was called. And I think it's interesting with students, a lot of the times the nature is that students will cycle out, so it's harder to make that community relationship. How have you seen students do that effectively, where the community trusts them in their reporting? Is it more of a trust in the institution of the university or individuals?
That's a really good question. And I think that's something that's worth thinking about, because yeah, students are always moving through universities and even, changing their positions and their involvement during their time as students. So I think that having some sort of consistency, like I think this case probably works better because it does have the professor that works with them to have some stability, even as the student staff might change. But I also think a lot of the building trust is just being there and doing the work and spending time with people. In this example with Eudora, they set up like office hours before the pandemic in a local coffee shop, where they said, on Tuesdays and Thursdays, we'll have our two of our reporters will be there just to chat about any questions or any local issues that you want to talk about. So I think it's a gradual process, but just showing people that you are there to listen and that you're there to be a resource. You're not just working on one story, like you're interested in building those relationships over the long term. I think that goes a long way.
So I read a story the other day by Sam Connon, who's a sports reporter at the Daily Bruin. He and I have been in contact for a little bit, and then I actually saw that you put it in your newsletter a couple days ago. But about how attending games in person builds some sort of like legitimacy for student journalism as quote unquote real journalism, and how it like builds respect among professional journalists for us. Do you have any more advice on how to make sure people are taking our work seriously?
Oh man, yeah, that's the thing in this past year, when there have been pieces in the Washington Post and Teen Vogue and others about like, look how great student journalists are doing in covering their campuses. It's great to see that recognition and to see them talking to students, but it also frustrates me a little bit because I'm like, do you not realize that they are always doing this work? It's not just when there's a pandemic or an election or, whatever other big event, students are there all the time. So I think, in terms of getting people to trust your work, just, I don't know, holding yourself to a high standard of professionalism, I think, when you're covering a beat like sports and, you might be, especially if you're at a school that has a bigger athletics program, you might be competing with other local beat writers or the Athletic or whoever else. But I think just the consistency of, doing the work, building the relationships, but also giving yourself room to make mistakes too, and realizing that your students and student publications are a training ground, that, your publication won't be perfect all the time, and that's okay. And, if you do have a misstep or have to make a correction to a story, don't beat yourself up too much for it and move forward and realize that, getting people to take you seriously it can be hard as a student journalist, but I think your work will also speak for itself in a lot of ways too.
Yeah, so this is having to do with team morale and in like managing an editorial team. I'm wondering if you had any tips about keeping the balance between making sure people are being consistent and timely and maintaining the standards of your paper, especially when there's a deadline, while also keeping up good morale and not discouraging anyone, and how to make sure the paper comes out on time and it's good standards, and keep maintain connections between editors and make sure you don't want to be like being too mean to anyone or feel like you're trying to control anyone.
Sure. Yeah, it's hard to find that balance too, especially when you're an editor and you're working with students who have all levels of experience, and some might be working on your paper or just to try it out and they want to write a few stories, but then some might be all in and like, this is what I want to do. And how do you find the balance between working with people at all of those levels? I think getting to know people outside of just the work that they're doing and building those relationships, I think will help you be able to work together better. It can be hard sometimes to find a line between, when you're good friends with someone that you're working with, how do you also nudge them to meet deadlines or hold them accountable? And it could be awkward at times, but I think ultimately, like, showing people that you care about them and their lives, not just for this story that you're waiting for them to turn in, but that you want them to feel comfortable if they're coming to you, if there's a circumstance or something going on that requires more flexibility, or if they can't meet a deadline for a certain reason. So I think just having, good communication and maybe trying to plan some sort of, not work related time together as a staff, like some sort of fun activity, when we can meet up with people in person again, hopefully, or even with Zoom, if there's a way you can do like a trivia night or something that's a way for people to get to know each other better, not just in a work context. I think that goes a long way.
I can ask one more question.
Sure.
One of the things our newspaper, the Daily Collegian at UMass Amherst, has focused on a lot, and me personally in my own projects, is linguistic access in newspapers. And I wonder if you've seen any students be specifically creative with that, and then in community reporting, like in different communities, if that's been something students have worked around, worked with different populations in their community, or students on campus.
Sure. So just to make sure I'm understanding your question, so just making sure, like, trying to publish things sometimes in different languages, or making sure they're accessible, like, to the people that you want to be reaching. Okay. Yeah, that's something that I've seen some publications try either as one-off issues or as continued parts within their student publication. So I think a good way to look at it first would be, before saying, we want to launch a whole, like a multilingual edition that we'll do every week or every month or whatever, just think about, like you mentioned, the specific stories, and think about who you want to reach with a story. And maybe that's a way to, look at it at a smaller scale, and it's not as overwhelming. If you're writing about, immigration policies and how those affect campus, or if you're doing a feature on a student group that, that has students that are involved who might be, speak a certain language and you want to reach them, think about those one-off stories and how you might be able to try to translate those, or work with those communities to reach them. And you might see a sense, all of you are at school too, you might see, like, depending on the language departments that your university has, maybe there's someone who's interested in doing some translation for your paper. That's, I think there's a lot of resources that you have being at a university that could be helpful to tap into in those cases. But yeah, and then I have seen some publications too that have done an ongoing, like, Spanish site. I think I'm trying to remember the specific example. I think DePaul University in the Chicago area, I think they launched a Spanish news site that has like its own dedicated, editor and staff that they work in conjunction with the student paper, if I remember that correctly. And there are also some schools in Texas that I know have done similarly. Like, I think the University of Texas in El Paso does some similar, like, multilingual work that's ongoing. So there are definitely examples that you can find, and maybe just talk with those editors too, and see, reach out to them and see what's worked, what hasn't worked, what have they learned.
Yeah. Hi. So one of the things that my old advisor kind of championed was he was still a believer in print ads. So we actually had about 6 ad representatives who were there working and actually getting paid more than the journalists, but bringing in some money. And I know that there's a whole strain of college advisors out there who are still very focused on the print product and their print ad revenue. And I was wondering if you've seen, I don't know, cases of that where profits might have continued to increase or maybe held steady instead of the decline that we're seeing all over the place.
Sure, that's a good question. I think ultimately, like, I would be cautious of being too dependent on any one revenue source. And I think that's something that professional papers have seen be a real issue when they relied on getting all their money from print, and then, their print subscribers get older and older and younger people aren't subscribing to print. I know that's a little different for student publications, where typically, the paper is put out there for free and anyone can read it regardless of if they subscribe or not. but then, you know, something like the pandemic happens and your in-person audience is not in person. So then if all of your money's coming from print, you know, then you really have to scramble to adapt. So I guess I would say, you know, there are, I'm sure, examples of places that have continued to have really strong print ad programs, but I think it's, even in that case, it's still good to think creatively about how you can be making money, whether it's also, you know, getting ads in your newsletters or seeing if, you know, there's businesses or organizations that would be interesting in, like, if you have a daily newsletter, you know, would they want to have an ad every day for a week, or would they want to sponsor it, or the different ways that you could approach that. Or like the membership program idea is really interesting to me as well. So I think, yeah, not to be a pessimist of print journalism, because I literally work for a newspaper, but I think that's something that continuing to be creative moving forward is going to be really, really important in the next, you know, 5 or 10 years of student journalism. I think we're just about out of time, but thank you all so much for having me and for the great questions. Please feel free to email and follow up. I always try to get back to students and make time to talk with you all if you want to talk about any of these issues more. But